Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and once again we have Rich Hammer, renowned attorney for church law and church tax, and we're just so glad to have you here, Rich, once again to talk about risk management, and today we're going to talk specifically about insurance coverage and limits.
Jerry, this is such really a complex and massive topic. We were talking before the show. We could spend months, if not years. So for the next 50 months, we're going to be talking about insurance coverage. And that just, it bespeaks the complexity of the topic and the fact that so many church leaders that are responsible for purchasing insurance for the church just don't know what to do. You're confused by it. And so what happens by default in many churches is the church will buy insurance because somebody in the church is an insurance agent. And with Acme Insurance Company, and well, let's just buy insurance from Joe. And that's not the way to do it, is it, Jerry?
No, actually it isn't. And actually, you know, it's amazing. A lot of people just buy insurance coverage because they have a church loan. So the loan company requires it. So, we've got to have that property insured. And so, you know, let's kind of split this out and let's talk about church property and the type of properties insurance we have, because I don't think we're going to get to the liability section. So we'll plan on this time. Let's just talk about the church property coverage and how much to insure and the limits and that sort of thing.
Okay, and Jerry, maybe we could start by addressing a question that I get all the time, and that is, Rich, how much insurance do we need? Let's limit it to, not to liability, we'll cover that in the future, but for today, how much property insurance does a church need?
You know, one of the things that I would actually tell your insurance agent to do is to run a Marshall Swift appraisal on your building so you make sure that you have a proper limit of insurance. A lot of policies have a coinsurance clause, which means that we're going to insure our building for replacement cost up to a certain percentage. So most companies have, let's say, an 80% coinsurance clause. So if we have a $1 million building, we need to insure that $1 million building for 80% of that million, or $800,000.
And if you do that, and you have a fire that destroys the whole building, how much insurance?
They'll pay up to the total amount of insurance that you have. Now, likewise, let's say you only insure that for $500,000. So we had $1 million worth of coverage as the replacement cost. We only insured it for $500,000. They're going to pay 50% over 8, or 5/8 of that claim for coverage, and you're going to have to pick up the additional cost.
And that's where we get the word co-insurance. You become a co-insurer with your insurance company to pay the loss.
Right, and most of the time you don't have a problem until you have a large loss, and that's not the time to find out if you have a proper limit of insurance.
And so, what should a church do to respond to that problem?
Well, what they should do is actually visit with their insurance agent, and they need to look at doing a Marshall Swift appraisal for their insured. Or, you know,
explain what that is.
Marshall Swift is an appraisal software that most insurance companies have. You could use Beck, which is another one, but your insurance agent should be able to calculate what the replacement cost is of that building. If you can't get it from your insurance company, maybe you had an appraisal done on your building when you refinanced it or when you bought the building, and the agent could look at that appraisal because it will normally give you replacement costs.
If it's recent.
If it's recent. Market value is so much different than replacement costs, and that's where so many people get confused. We want to insure for replacement costs because you want to be able to replace that building, not just have a little bit of coverage where you don't have enough coverage at the end to replace it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the issues that arise when we're talking about property insurance for the church. And Jerry, one of them would be for unique items. A lot of churches have very unique items that sometimes are of great value. For example, stained glass windows, artwork, sound equipment, and maybe organs or handbells, instruments. And a lot of times churches don't realize that those unique assets are not insured under your general property insurance policy. There have to be special endorsements to cover those. You want to address that?
Yeah, what you should do is actually, if you have something special like a high dollar organ or high dollar stained glass, or if you have sound equipment that may leave the premises, or even a mower that would leave the premises to go mow a vacant lot you have someplace else. You need to have an inland marine policy. And what I would do is actually get an appraisal on, if you have some high dollar items, you need to get an appraisal, and that way it justifies what you're insuring the value for. A lot of companies, as you said, will limit the amount that they'll pay out for an organ or for stained glass. So you want to make sure that you have that. Likewise, if you have, a lot of our youth groups will take the lighting equipment or sound equipment or musical instruments, to another church to perform or to a school to perform, or take lawnmowers that they may have to go mow, some widow's, yard. They need to have coverage once those leave the premises. A normal property policy, contents policy, will not cover away when you go 100 foot away from the premises. So you need to make sure that you have an inland marine policy. Also, when you look at contents as a total, you need to look at what you have as your cost in those contents to set the value of your total contents to begin with.
And so that's where it's important, I think, for churches to maintain, just like with your home, to maintain accurate inventories of these properties.
Absolutely. If we can give them a worksheet.
And even a video inventory.
Video inventory works great. A lot of insurance companies will do that for an insured. But yeah, most people will not remember exactly what they had. We had 4 hammers and 3 wrenches, in our toolbox. Most people do not know that. And a lot of times when a claim occurs, what does the church insurance company do? They ask you, can you give us the receipts of what we're replacing?
That's right.
So if you have a video inventory and or you have an inventory period, that just helps justify your claim up to that limit.
Jerry, you mentioned this before, but I think it's so important. I don't want to pass over this. And that's to make the distinction, which I think is lost on a lot of church leaders, of market value versus replacement cost. Why is that important, and how should a church respond to that?
Well, replacement cost will actually take the cost to actually replace a building. You may have only paid $1 million for your church, because that's what the market is worth right now. But to replace it, because of building costs, it may cost $2 million to replace it if you were to build it back today. If you insure for market value, you could run into a co-insurance problem, again, with your building. However, if you insure it for replacement cost, then you can actually replace that building and bring a contractor in where you don't have that issue.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That's very important. Now talk about boilers.
It's interesting. We had a boiler blow up at a church. We've also had a boiler blow up at a university that we're both very familiar with. If a church has a boiler, so a hot water vessel, they need to have boiler coverage, because if an explosion occurs with that boiler, normally it is going to be the boiler coverage that will apply. Explosions normally are excluded under a property form. So if you have a boiler down in the basement, you need to have boiler coverage. When an explosion occurs, a lot of times it will be the boiler policy that will pick up the coverage for that.
Very good. Well, let's move on to another very important topic under property insurance, and that's the topic of exclusions. Now, an exclusion is a loss that's not covered or maybe not fully covered under the church insurance policy. And Jerry, when we're talking about property insurance, there are a number of exclusions and these often come as a shock to church leadership. They just buy the insurance policy for property and they think it covers everything, and then something happens and they find out that they submit a claim to their insurance company only to find out that that's excluded under the policy. It is so important. I think it's probably one of the most important things that you do in evaluating coverage is to look at the exclusion section. A lot of times that's worded in such a way that it's not readily apparent what that means, and that's why it's important to have somebody, on, not necessarily on staff, but in your church perhaps, maybe a banker or an attorney or a CPA that can help you in interpreting exclusions as well as other provisions in the policy to make sure you understand what you have. And some of the exclusions that apply to property insurance would include, for example, earthquake. Mold, that's a hot topic today. I was dealing with the church just yesterday that has a mold issue, and there's a dispute with their insurance company. And also drain backups. You might want to talk about some of these exclusions.
Yeah, actually there's a ton of exclusions that are to a policy. And let's talk about first what kind of form you want to have on your policy. I would suggest that every insured have what is called special form, which means that we're going to cover everything except. There's also a basic form and a broad form that specifically says we're going to cover fire, lightning, windstorm, hail. It tells exactly what it's going to cover. The special form, of course, is more broad because it says we're going to exclude these, where the basic form actually says we're only going to include these. So when you get to, but most of them all have common exclusions. Let's talk about earthquake, wind, hail, flood insurance. We'll just kind of limit it to those for right now.
Or mold.
Mold. I don't know of a single insurance company that will normally cover mold unless it came from a flood and it didn't get taken care of. Then the flood policy will pick it up, but they're really not picking up flood or mold coverage. They're picking up the damage from the flood. The damage occurred because of the flood, and therefore the flood policy will apply to it. But mold is normally excluded on all policies. And I don't know of a single insurance company that will normally cover mold. And I say that.
Let me say this, Jerry, and just to stop you for a second. And the thing about mold, it not only is implicated under the property insurance, but it can be implicated under liability or employment practices. The church I dealt with the other day, they have a staff member who claims that he is no longer, he's an associate pastor. He claims that he's no longer able to work at the church because he has a hyperallergy or sensitivity to mold. And he can now no longer work there. And so the church leadership is struggling with this question of what do we do with this person? Do we terminate him? And if we do, can he sue us for some type of disability discrimination? And so it's interesting how some of these issues kind of overlap into other insurance coverages.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we've actually had where a person was hypoallergenic and would the work comp cover it because he was still working there? Mm-hmm. And the church didn't really have the money to try to remediate the mold. Mold remediation can be very, very expensive, as you know. Let's talk about wind, hail, and earthquake. A lot of times, if you need that coverage, you can get that coverage. If you're coastal, or if you're in California or even Missouri here, right there by the Mississippi River, if you need earthquake coverage or if you need wind hail coverage, a lot of times they'll throw a larger deductible, which is normally a percentage deductible on your policy. But most of the time you can pick up that coverage. You need to make sure that your agent is not excluding that or the insurance company is not excluding that coverage. Flood insurance. If you're in a floodplain, and actually most agents can actually look at a map because the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Protection Act, will actually have a map of the whole United States and what is considered in a floodplain. If you're considered in a floodplain, you need to have flood insurance. Because
don't you think it's true that a lot of pastors don't know if they're in a floodplain or not?
No, and they need to ask their agents to look at the map because most of the time they build the building, and you may be in a 100-year floodplain. Well, it's never flooded here, but you guys buy the building, and then the flood comes. But yeah, you need to actually. One of the things that we do at AG Financial is any insured we have, we automatically check it. We check any loan that AG Financial does. We automatically check on that loan to see if it's in a floodplain to let the company know that there's a flood issue that may not be covered down the road. So that's one of the things we do.
We'll talk about hail damage.
Hail damage, actually most of the time hail is covered under most policies. However, there's called named storm, which is really what I would consider hurricane or tropical storms. If you're
not many hailstorms have names.
No, not many. We can give them names, but as many as hit Kansas and Missouri here, we've had our issues, and a lot of companies now are putting deductibles on just hail because of the amount of hail damage we've had here in Kansas and Missouri and other places.
You get that basketball-sized hail pounding that on your roof, and you got problems.
You've got problems. Yeah, I had to have my roof replaced here a couple years ago, and I was kind of glad that the hailstorm took care of that because it was completely covered. Let's talk about something that most people would not even think about. How about ordinance of law coverage? If you have to rebuild your building and the laws have changed or the city ordinance have changed to rebuild that building, you have partial damage to that building. And they say the ordinances now say because you have a 2-story building, you have to have an elevator. And you didn't have an elevator previously. You're going to have the cost, and an elevator is not cheap. It's going to cost you probably close to $50,000 to $100,000 to put that elevator in. But the city is requiring that. Your normal policy is not going to cover that because you didn't have it before. Ordinance of law coverage will pick up if the ordinance have changed. So if you're in an older building, especially if you're in an older building, and you know that it is not up to code, you want to make sure that you have ordinance of law coverage. We also have a question here that I think that we'll address at the same time. It says, does my property insurance cover any building code charges required for city government? We just answered that one. What if I have a large building, multi-story building, that we're not using the whole building, and I don't want to insure the whole building? Is there a way to do this? And actually there is. It's called modified replacement cost. And what you can do is talk to your insurance company. It's normally cost a little bit more, but what you're going to do is say, we're going to build this building back as a 1-story versus a 2 or 3-story. We find in a lot of cities, you've got people that will occupy a lot of buildings that may have 1, 2, 3 stories, and they only use the bottom floor. They can insure that building, not for the complete replacement cost, which may be astronomical with it being 3 or 4 or 5 stories, but you can insure it where we're only going to want to replace the bottom floor. And so what you would do is you'd figure out what the replacement cost is for the bottom floor, and it's called modified replacement cost, and you can talk to your agent about that.
So you would replace the usable portion of the premises.
Right, and you'd only insure the usable portion of the premises. So that's a great question, and appreciate that. If you have any questions during this, again, I'm going to limit it to property. I've already got some liability questions here. But if you have property questions, just feel free to email us. I get them right here, and we'll try to answer those for you.
Jerry, I mentioned at the start how I've seen this happen in a lot of churches. The selection of insurance coverage is not really an informed decision. It's rather, we have a person in the church that works for Acme Insurance Company. Let's just buy our coverage from Joe. And that may not be the best outcome for the church. And so let's talk for a minute about the whole issue of church insurance companies versus insurance companies that sell church insurance.
We've got several. We've seen several claims that have come in from companies that are not what I would call church underwriters. Exactly what you're talking about. There's companies that specialize in writing nonprofits and churches specifically. In my opinion, those are the companies that you really want to try to do business with. So you need to know how much. One of the things that they can ask their agent is, how much insurance, what kind of value, or how much volume do you have in writing churches? So you know what kind of expertise that company has in writing churches. We see far too often where you have somebody picking it up because somebody is a agent for a certain company and I can write the church, but there is not the proper coverages, whether they be liability coverages or property coverages. I'm sorry, we can't cover stained glass. I'm sorry, we can't cover organs. I'm sorry, we don't have sexual abuse coverage. A lot of times there's companies out there that are not specific writers of church insurance, and they don't know how to cover them. So we have issues there.
Let me bring up another topic here that arises, I think, in the liability side too, and that's the whole issue of umbrella coverage. Okay. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Let's talk about how much umbrella coverage you should have. Umbrella coverage actually is a liability form, but we'll go ahead and, since you brought it up, we'll go ahead and address it today. What umbrella coverage does will go over your liability limits, general liability, automobile liability, work comp. What it will do is give you an excess of either $1 million, $2 million, $100 million, anywhere up normally at $1 million increments above and beyond your other insurance to take care of a claim. How many claims have we seen that have happened with national offices, with district offices or regional offices, or actually even churches, where $1 million is not enough coverage? And those umbrellas help cover the assets of that church.
At a fairly modest increment.
It is fairly reasonable. You know, I know that we were visiting the other day, and a question came up: how much umbrella coverage do I need? And one of the things that I would say to people is, what do you have to lose? And we look at how much people have, what they have to lose, and what actually do they have that could cause a large loss. And we normally will look at that to help determine what kind of limit that they should have. We'll always let them pick the limit, but we'll help determine by at least bringing things to mind, and they can figure out what their risks are. Let's talk about builder's risk coverage, because that's one of the things that we haven't talked about. A lot of churches right now, because they can't afford to go build a new church, may be adding on to their old church. And one of the things that happens is today there's a plethora of air conditioning units being stolen, and or the lumber company drops off a load of lumber at the church because they're going to be building on the inside, and they call the next day and said, lumber company, you need to deliver the lumber. Our people are ready for it. And they said, we delivered it yesterday.
Or how about copper piping?
Copper piping is, as you know, copper piping is number one on thieves' list right now. You need to have a builder's risk policy, or to have your property policy cover theft of building materials. That can be an endorsement that can be added to your policy if you're going through a renovation and or new construction. So builder's risk is something that most people don't even think about, that they need to think about.
If you're going to have some kind of improvement or construction project,
Let's talk about crime coverage too while we're at it. One of the things that most people don't even think about is crime coverage, because you're a church. Who would steal from the church? How many times have we seen the accountant and or the head usher that counts the money? They go on vacation and the money's
all of a sudden we have an uptick.
We have lots of money, and then somebody comes in and does an audit for the church. And we find out that Sally Sue has been stealing from the church for 20 years. We never believed that would happen. And you're not talking, normally when this happens, it is over a time period that most of the time we're seeing 20 to 30 years. And the way crime coverage normally reads is the last policy in effect is the only one that applies. So you can't go back and say, well, I had $100,000 worth of employee dishonesty this year, but I've had it for the last 20 years, so I want $100,000 for each year. It doesn't work that way. Whoever is the last company to apply is the one that happens. And I can tell you that sitting where we sit, employee dishonesty, monies and securities, that sort of coverage is almost a must, because you have a large church, there are ways for people to steal and you not realize it. So crime coverage is very, very important.
And that's a reason why certainly churches above a certain size, it's very advantageous for you to have a CPA audit your financial statements, because one of the best aspects of a full audit, I'm not talking about limited engagements, is you will receive something called a management letter from your CPA firm, and that's going to highlight all the areas of problems with what are called your internal controls, your handling of cash and resources and assets, and it will help you to institute policies that are going to make embezzlements or thefts much less common. So that, to me, that's one of the great reasons for having a CPA audit, as well as just the accountability and making sure that your financial statements accurately portray the finances of the church. Another topic I want to mention, Jerry, because I've seen this happen a number of times, is where a church doesn't realize it, but maybe they procrastinated for whatever reason. The policy period has expired, and then there's a loss. Are there grace periods, or what if your policy is a calendar year basis and you failed to renew for the new year, and there's a loss in the first days or weeks of the new year?
Normally there is no grace period.
Unlike some life insurance policies.
Yes, exactly. If your policy has expired and the loss occurs after that date, they may have a 10-day grace period because it's direct bill and they give you so much grace. I would get that paid immediately before that. Most of the time there is a notice of cancellation form that goes to an insurance, to the insured. So a company will notify you if you're paying a payment that are our intent to cancel. You need to get that paid before that cancellation takes place, which could be considered a grace period with most companies. But if they haven't received payment and they cancel it and the policy is canceled, once that policy is canceled, they're not going to pay the claim. Mm-hmm. So we could have a definite issue there. Most companies, I don't really consider have a grace period once a policy is canceled. But if they give you that notice of intent to cancel, until that policy actually is canceled, you still do have coverage.
Mm-hmm. Very important point to be calendared on the official church calendar when these policies expire, so you can have plenty of lead time there to not only renew the policy, but to make decisions as to whether you want to change coverage in any respect, or companies.
Let's talk a little bit. There's one thing that has happened with a lot of our churches are doing that I know that most insurance companies would never even think about. Garage keepers insurance. Mm-hmm. And you go, why in the world would our church need garage keepers insurance? If we have, at our church, of course, we have where we change oil for the widows and for the elderly. And we'll take their car, change the oil, or we may actually park their car for them. If we damage their car, we need garage keepers insurance to protect that damage to that car. Mm. And I will tell you that on in the Assemblies of God program that we have, we've made that an endorsement. But I know of really no other insurance company that even thinks about it, or most insureds that would even think about it. Let's also talk about applications and the importance about applications. Mm-hmm. How you fill out that application will be considered at the time of a claim. So if there's misleading information on an application, there may not be coverage, or they may try to prevent coverage from happening. Recently, we had a church that had a daycare center, but on the application, they did not mark the box that said that they had a daycare center.
And that was not necessarily intentional. It was just a clerk that worked in the church office, and here's this insurance application, and she just did not have sophistication when it came to this, and she was instructed, to fill out this application, and I'm convinced that was an oversight. It was not intentional, but the fact was, one of the hundreds of questions that she had to fill out, does the church maintain a preschool or child care facility? And she just passed over that and didn't check yes. And unfortunately, a 3-year-old child died at the child care program, and the issue that the insurance company raised was that there was no coverage because of the misrepresentation by the church in its application for insurance. They didn't check that box that said we operate a preschool or child care facility, and that became a very unfortunate dispute because, as you can imagine, the damages, the potential damages in a death of a 3-year-old child at a church preschool, those can be astronomical.
Yeah, it's real important that somebody look over those applications, and those, and when they fill out those applications. Don't let your insurance agent just fill it out for you. Let them ask the questions, go over the specific questions, because that's another reason why also to go with a company that actually writes just churches and nonprofits. There's most likely going to be coverage. This was with a company that does not specifically write churches, and they were more looking for a reason not to cover it versus to cover it. Mm-hmm. So why don't you talk a little bit also about the duty to notify?
Oh my, yes, that's true under any church insurance policy, including property or liability, as we'll see next month. And that's a duty, again, it's in the boilerplate, it's in the fine print of your policy, that one of the duties of the insured is the duty to notify, and the duty to cooperate in any investigation by the insurance company. These are conditions precedent to coverage, meaning that if you violate these conditions, if you don't follow them, you're potentially going to lose any coverage. So there have been a number of cases. We'll talk about some of these in more detail next month on the liability side. But if you know of a potential claim, you have a duty to notify the insurance company of that claim or potential loss so that they have the opportunity. The whole purpose for this is they can come in and investigate what's going on. And you're denying them that right by not notifying, and that can result in a lack of coverage.
We got a couple questions. I know we're really running slim on time here, so I'm going to just try to answer these questions. We have an electronic sign on our building. Is it covered? If it's attached to your building, most policies will automatically cover your sign. If your sign is more than 100 feet away from your premises, you need to have specific coverage, and it can be done under an inland marine policy.
Check with your agent.
Check with your agent on your sign. What is actual cash value? My agent said actual cash value coverage is cheaper than replacement cost. It may be cheaper, but realize that you're only covering the actual cash value of it. So when you have a claim, they're going to take depreciation into consideration and only pay you a partial settlement on your claim. So co-insurance, again, are you insuring it to replacement cost or are you insuring it for actual cash value?
Excellent.
If you want actual cash value and you want that lower amount, then that's fine. I would never suggest it. I always suggest replacement cost. Once again, we appreciate your time. I know I haven't gotten to everybody's questions. We're going to talk about this next month. We're going to pick up all the liability issues that may occur. And I know a lot of people ask liability questions. We'll get to those next month when we talk about that topic. We appreciate your time. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.